All right, I will say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Let us begin. All right, begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Nissan. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Joshua this month in memory of Paul's father and mother, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah bas Avraham. And to thank Avraham and Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all the Sherman Joshua this month in memory of Sarah, Bryna, bas Yehoshua, Heschel. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in nechama. I will say with that, let us begin. An interesting daf today. We actually referenced it earlier on. Today's daf is Samech 60. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem on the bottom of Nun Tes Amud Beis 59b. 59b. So the Mishnah says as follows: Nazir shahayatami b'safek umuchlat b'safek. Okay, so we have a little bit of an interesting and intriguing situation. Like I said, we've already made reference to this case before. You have a Nazir who has, I will say, just so you understand, this is in line with the theme of the parak, because remember again, how do we open up this parak? Safek Tumah. Safek Tumah. So the opening Mishnah of the parak, which again we just concluded yesterday, was the idea of two Nazirim walking down the road. And what happens? Ruvain, another guy, standing at a distance, right? We set it up in the Gemara that he's standing at a distance of at least Daled Amas, right? In order that it's a Safek Tumah B'Rshus HaRabim. So he goes ahead, Safek Tumah B'Rshus HaYachid, standing at a distance of Daled Amas, and what does Ruvain say? Previous Mishnah? What does Ruvain say? Somebody became Tameh. I don't know who became Tameh. Fine. Then we went through the entire process that these two guys have to undergo in order to go ahead and figure out, essentially to cover their bases. And that's really what it is, essentially to cover their bases. That was Mishnah 1. Mishnah 2, that we did yesterday and spoke about what? What happens if one of those two guys die? Right? So how do you resolve the suffix? Continuing in this, so we're talking about one guy, so we're back to one guy now, one guy with multiple layers of suffix. So watch this. So Nazir shahaya tamei b'safek umuchlat b'safek. So we'll say we're talking about now a guy who was tamei b'safek. Now remember again, tuma in this context always refers to what? Tumas meis. So there's a safek. Did he come in contact with the corpse? I will say that's one layer of safek, and then there's another layer of safek, which is safek isya mitzora. So we'll say, so take a quick look at the Rush for just a moment. So the Rush says over here, Nazir shahaya tamei b'safek umuchlat b'safek. Sorry, we'll say actually not the Rush. I'm actually going to draw your attention to Likutei Rashi. You see, do you have that in your margin? Likutei Rashi? I have it on my page. It's on the right-hand side of the page. No? Sorry. Okay. All right, hopefully. Good. If not, you'll listen. So Likutei Rashi. Right? Nazir says, if you see, it's about 8 lines in. Nazir shahaya tamei b'safek umuchlat b'safek shenitma b'meis b'safek b'yom rishon shal nazirus b'safek hulo em nichlat v'nirpa b'yom rishon shal naziruso. So we'll say, so ultimately the way that Rashi, or the Likutei Rashi, is framing this case is essentially you have an individual who has a safek tumah on the first day of his Nazirite vow, of his Nazir Nazirus, and there's also, it's not clear, is he healed from his tsaras on that day as well? That's the suffix that's unfolding over here. So I'll say, so therefore again, a double suffix. So the Gemara says as follows, actually not the Gemara yet, sorry. Fine. So the Mishnah goes on, and the Mishnah says, so what happens? I will say, Ochel bekachim achar shishim yom, so we'll say in a case like this, so ultimately again he drinks wine. He's able to go ahead. He's able to eat kachim, which refers to karbanos after 60 days. So we'll say what that means is his tumah is essentially fully resolved after 60 days. And his nazirus is only completed after 120 days. Okay, so I will say, so now listen to this. So why is that? So take a look again at Likutei Rashi. Right? So we'll say, so again, take a look at Likutei Rashi, right where we were before. Right, it says, Ochel bekachim achar shishim b'shosei yayin v'tam l'mesim achar meh ve'esim yom. So we'll say, so here, this is just going to help frame what it is that's unfolding over the course of this Mishnah. So take a look. He says, She'ilu Im hayatame vadai umuchlat vadai hayatzarch legaleach la'alter taglachas tzaras ubesof shiva yamim b'mei sifro. So Rabbi says, remember again, let's just translate over here. If he was definitively vadai, right, and ultimately again, definitively a muchlat, i.e., right, definitively a metzora who has been healed, he would be obligated to go ahead and shave immediately. Right, taglachas saras, he would be obligated to shave immediately to remedy his saras. Ubesof shiva yamin, and at the end of 7 days, because remember again, the purification process for saras extends 7 days. So ubesof shiva yimei limei sifro megaleach shenis, he would shave again. Umaybe carbon va'ochal b'kachim, he'd be able to go out and bring carbon, and he kachim. They will say that would be in a case of where we definitively knew his status. Va'achar limnos shiva yamin, the taglach, the tuma, va'achar limnos shloshim nazir. So say then he'd finish off the tuma, then he'd do another 30 days ultimately again of nazirus. Because what says we've already established, remember again, what did we emerge from the previous sugya? That saras is docha nazirus. Right? They will say, remember again, what does that mean practically? So we know that halacha lamaisa, a nazir is not permitted to shave his head. But yet again, part of the purification process for saras is shaving your head. And therefore we learned out either from Rosho or Zikano, remember again, that was the whole drasha, that the hair cutting of Metzora is docha, the prohibition of not cutting your hair by a Nazir. So he goes on, look what the Rashi says, so Kitzan Lekaman be'idach pirkin taglachas hanega docha taglachas hanazir bizman shu vadai v'lo bizman shu safek. Okay, so we'll say, see here it is. But the only time that hair cutting of tzaras is docha, the prohibition to cut your hair of a nazir is when there is a definitive obligation as a metzora. Right? That's when there's a definitive obligation, that's when ultimately again you cut your hair even as a nazir. However, so we'll say, so again, we're not going to do the rest of this, but essentially what you begin to see is here's what's at play over here. See, I will say, the problem is when you have suffix cases, so suffix do not necessarily allow you to set aside prohibitions. So because of that, when you have this situation of a nazir, right, a guy who was definitive, so if you look at this case, the only thing we definitively know is what? That he's a nazir. That's what we know. What ended up happening over here? So now he contracts tumah b'suffix. Possibly became exposed to a corpse. That's possibility number one. Possibility number two is it's a suffix whether or not he's healed from his saras. So I will say, because we have two sveikos, the Mishnah explains, and again, you could look at the rest of Rashi, Rashi puts out all the calculations, which we don't need to go through ourselves right now to get the point of the Mishnah, but the point of what I will say is, when you go through all the sveikos and work them through, he's only cleared from his tumah after 60 days, and he's only cleared from his naziros ultimately after 120 days. Fine. Why? Here it is. Shetaglachas hanega docha taglachas hanazir. Because when do we say that ultimately cutting your hair for tzaras ultimately is docha, sets aside the prohibition of a nazir to cut his hair? Bizman shuvadai. Only when there is a definitive obligation. Ava bizman shu safek ino docha. But ultimately, again, when it's a suffix, ultimately suffix is not docha. So I will say, because suffix is not docha, therefore, again, it's going to take a much longer amount of time to work through all of these sveikos. Fine. So I'll say that's the Mishnah. We actually referenced this earlier as well. Take a look at top of Samech. So it says the Gemara, Tana, when is this so? I'll say, when is what so? When is it so that you have to wait 120 days, right? In this case of suffix, that it's going to take 120 days to work through all of the seikas and be permitted to drink wine and become tamei l'meisim, i.e., when is it going to take 120 days in order for your neder nazirus to be completed? Ultimately, again, nazirus mu'atas. That's talking about, we'll say nazirus mu'atas. What's nazirus mu'atas? Remember, 30 days. 30 days. Now, we'll say, now obviously it goes without saying, the longer the duration of the nazirus, then what? The longer it's going to take to rectify the suffix. So therefore it says, Aval benazirus bas shana. But for example, if you have a nazirus that it would extend for a year, ochel bekadshim, you can only eat, because I'll say this would be the same case. You have a nazir who has a 1 year neder nazirus. And then what happens? There's a suffix tumah, and a suffix whether or not he was healed from his tzaras. So now he has upon him a neder naziros for a year. So we'll say for a guy like that, it's going to take as follows. He says, Ochal b'kachim la'achar shtei shanim. It's going to take 2 years to ultimately, again, allow him to come to a state of Torah where he could eat kachim. V'shosem tam l'mesim la'achar arba shanim. And I will say, it'll be 4 years. It'll be 4 years, ultimately, again, until his neder naziros is successfully completed. And I will say, by the way, what an incredible musar. I will say, you know what the worst thing in life is? The worst thing in life is suffix. Suffix. So I will say, when you live, that's why the Gemara Chazal tell us, Ein simcha ka'ataras hasveikos. There is no greater joy in life than resolution of doubt. See, I will say, in life, if I know, think about it just a moment. If I know that I'm tameh, metaphorically, what does this mean? If I know that I'm wrong, I know that I'm doing things wrong. Right? Don't raise your hand, right? By the way, say, we all know we're doing things wrong. At least if I know that I'm doing things wrong, then what? I know what I have to fix. I know what I have to do. Maybe I'm not even doing it now. Also, we've spoken on this a lot, like in last week. There are many times in life where I know I'm doing something wrong, and I know I'm not fixing it now. I'm not even attempting to fix it now. That's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but lamaisa, as long as I know that it's wrong, there's a chance that Emeretz Hashem, I'll get to fix it in the future. When a person lives in suffix, Rabosai, so what ends up happening? So now my whole life is in this ambiguity, right? It's gray, is it right, is it wrong, is it this, is it that? It takes years. Everything takes so much longer to resolve. That's the Musar Heschel over here. When you know you're tameh, okay, there's a process. I'm going to get through it, I'll get to the end of it, I'll be fine. Suffix is like a fog. It's like a fog. I don't even know where the end is, and the truth is, in a fog, it's also so easy to get lost. Such a musar. The Gemara goes like, Tani Allah, we said about this case, Umigaleach arba taglachios. So we'll say, in this case of suffix, what's end up happening is it's actually 4 head shavings. 4 haircuts, 4 head shavings. Listen to this. So we'll say, so taglachas rishona. So we'll say, for the first taglachas, for the first head shaving, maybe tziporim. Ultimately, again, the Nazir will bring his bird offerings. I will say, now remember again, those bird offerings are for his tzaras. So in the first head shaving, right, he'll go ahead and that'll be a head shaving for tzaras. He'll bring his bird offerings, the chatas ha'of va'olas behema. Furthermore, again, I will say, he'll bring his chatas of olas behema. Now, what is that for? That's for being a metzora tameh. So in the first hair cutting, that's where he addresses his tzaras, and where he addresses being a Nazir Tameh. Fine. Shnia, second hair cutting, maybe Chata Sa'of va'olas behema. He'll bring Chata Sa'of, ultimately again, and olas behema. Fine. Shlishis, third hair cutting, maybe Chata Sa'of va'olas behema. Same karbanos. Revius, maybe karbantara. Only by the time you get to the fourth hair cutting, now remember, the timing of these hair cuttings all depends on what? The duration of the Naziros, right? The duration of the Naziros. So remember again, that's why, like, for example, the 120 days that the Mishnah brought down was dafka for our Nazir Mo'ates, a 30-day Naziros. Obviously, again, the longer the Naziros, the longer the timeline is extended. The common denominator is, no matter how long the Naziros itself actually extends, halacha l'maisa, there's always going to have to be the same 4 hair cuttings and the same 4 karbanos brought with each of those hair cuttings in order to properly resolve the doubt. Beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amrit, taglachas rishon. So we'll say, now let's talk about these 4 hair cuttings and what we're doing at each of them. So Amrit, taglachas rishon, in the first hair cutting, so we said, what do you bring? You bring your tziporim, which are your karbanos, ultimately again for saras, chatas ha'of and olas ha'of, which are the karbanos for Nazir Tameh. So listen to this. So maybe, Mimanav Shach, Shaper Kamaisi. So I'll say the Gemara is not challenging. Interested of what the Gemara is doing over is the Gemara is affirming. Right? And the Gemara is saying, yes, that is the right choice of karbanos. Now, why is that the right choice of karbanos? So watch this. The Gemara says, Mimanav Shach, Shaper Kamaisi, Di'i Vadai Mitzoruhu V'lav Tameh. So watch this. Because if the individual in question is a Vadai Mitzorah and he's not Tameh, so remember again, in any of these situations, what we have is multiple possibilities, right? Remember, the only thing we know definitively in this case is that this guy is a Nazir. Everything else is a suffix. Is Siyam Mitzorah, right? Is he Tameh? So therefore the Gemara says, the way we just structured the Karbanos essentially leverages all of the risks. So watch, it's actually fascinating. He says, listen to this. The Vadai Mitzorah, because if the Nazir in question is a Vadai Mitzorah, Velav Tamehu, but he's not Tameh. So we'll say possibility one is, he's an actual Mitzorah, but he's not Tameh Tumas Meis. So then if that's the case, Tziporin Chovaso, he'll bring ultimately again the birds as his obligation. Because remember again, the bird offerings are for who? Bird offerings are for who? Are for the Mitzorah. Notice I'll just say something very, very quickly. You know, Rashi HaKodesh brings down the pasuk in Parshas Mitzorah, or Tazria, I think it's Parshas Mitzorah, right? The karbanos of the Mitzorah are birds, right? Rashi says, why does the Mitzorah bring birds? Why does the Mitzorah bring birds? Because why does a person contract saras? Right? Because you're talking too much, like chirping, right? So the excessive talking that leads to lashon hara, right? That causes saras is like the chirping of the birds. So once I saw a beautiful Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh brings down, that's fine, but the Mitzorah brings how many birds? 2 birds. And in fact, what happens to the 2 birds? Right? One of them is shechted, and what? One of them flies away. So this is what's the pshat? And the Baal Shem says something so incredibly beautiful. He says, because in every act of lashon hara, there's dual liability. There's the negative words that you spoke. I will say, but in those very same moments that I was speaking slanderous speech, I could have used my koach hadibor for something positive. I could have used those same words to build someone up. I could have used those same words to engender avas Yisrael. So in other words, that the shechted bird represents the avera, the bird that flies away represents the lost opportunity. And I will say, if you think about that duality, it really applies to all averas. Right? The real tragedy of sin is a compounded loss. Right? On one hand, there's the avera that I did. But I will say, but the reality is, in that same moment that I was committing an avera, I also could have what? I could have done something positive. So every avera represents a dual loss. The thing that I did wrong, and the lost opportunity that I had to do something good with that same time, with that same energy. Such an incredible idea. In any event, so we'll say, so the Gemara says as follows. So the tziporin makes sense, right? Because remember again, we're talking about a scenario here where he's a vadai mitzorah. So if the tziporin then would make sense, right? So the Gemara says, so good. Di vadai tziporin v'lav tami utziporin chavaso. The chata sa'of safek azla l'kvura. Now, both remember again, the chata sa'of, now remember, interesting enough for us, we normally have a principle that a chatas cannot be brought out of safek. Interestingly enough, there is one exception to that rule, which is chatas ha'of. Chatas ha'of zrika can be done misafek, but ultimately, again, you would go ahead and bury the carcass of the bird after. In other words, you wouldn't offer up the body. And remember, all you need is zrika anyway. So that's how you leverage the risk. Right? Va'ola, and the ola that's being brought, havyu nadava. Ultimately, again, that could be brought as in nadava, not a problem. The Gemara says, "Ulagalcho toch shiva iafshar." Now, the truth is, the ability to go ahead and do another haircut at the end of 7 days is impossible. Why? The dilma lav muchlahu. Because also remember again, perhaps what? Perhaps he's not a vadai mitzorah. Now, if you're not a vadai mitzorah, then what? You can't do another haircut at the end of 7 days. Why? Because that's going to shter and undermine the naziros. V'rachmana amar tar lo ya'avar al rosho ad melos. Fine. So we'll say that's possibility number 1. Possibility number 2. Ilav mitzorah vadahu, right? V'hutame. So scenario number 2 is, again, he's a Nazir. Maybe he's not a mitzorah, but he is vaday tameh. He absolutely has tumas mei. So now the karbanos make sense as well. Why? Chata sa'ov chavaso. If that's the case, ultimately again, chata sa'ov will be obligatory for his tumah, Vitziporin avroi kamis avdin. And I will say, anyway, the birds would be offered up outside, and therefore there's no problem with chulin la'azara. V'lo havi chulin ba'azara. V'olas behema havyin adava. And ultimately, again, the olas behema could be offered up as an adava. Fine, that's possibility 2. Possibility 3. V'im lav mitzorahu v'lav tamehu. They will say, there is a third possibility. What's the third possibility? He's not tameh, and he's not a mitzorah. Right, that's the third possibility. And all he is what? All he is what? Just the Nazir. So listen, now watch this. So tziporin avrei kamisab. Then the birds are offered up outside anyway. Therefore, again, no problem of chulin lazara. Chata sa'of lekvura. Ultimately, the chatas of you could do the zrika, but you won't offer up the body on the mizbeach; it'll be buried, right? Olas behemia havya chavaso, and ultimately, again, the olas behema will satisfy his obligation. I v'haba yasham. But 1 second, you still require an asham. Also, I will say the asham is for mitzora. What are you doing about the asham? In other words, you still have to leverage a risk. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Da'amar maisi umasni. It's Rabbi Shimon who holds that halacha l'maisi. You can bring the asham, but you bring a conditional asham. And I will say, what's a conditional asham? I will say, if you take a look at Rashi, it's almost right across in Rashi. In other words, if you just move your finger rightwards into Rashi, a few lines down. So Rashi says, Hamani Rabbi Shimon hi da'amar maisi umasni ki darmina parak basha da mesechas menachos Rabbi Shimon omer lemachras maybe ashamo velugo imo va'omer imitzor hu ze ashamo v'ze lugo v'imlav asham ze yeshamei nedava. So what's Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that interestingly enough you can bring a conditional asham. Rabbi say interestingly enough the sacrificial rights for an asham are the same sacrificial rights for a nedava. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that you can bring a conditional asham and just stipulate if I'm required to bring the asham, it should be an asham, and if not, what? It should ultimately go ahead and be a nedava. Says the Gemara. Fine, masni. Taglach hashnia ushlishis tziporin lo tzarech. So we'll say this is the case where he's not right, where he's not going to be tamei, or he's not in the TORAH. So if that's the case again, taglach hashnia ushlishis tziporin lo tzarech. You don't need the second hair cutting. You don't need the third hair cutting. You don't need the tziporin. The ha'avid. So ma'ika. So ultimately again, I will say. So what chashash would we have? Dilma vadai muchlatu. So we'll say perhaps ultimately again he is a vadai muchlat, in other words mitzora, to which the Gemara says chada l'safek sifro v'chada l'safek tum aso. If that's the case, I will say ultimately again one oath would come to go ahead and for the safek sifro. Sifro, I will say, remember again refers to the days of Tara, and ultimately again one for the safek of his tumah. And I will say now what's interesting about this is as follows. So the Rush points out over here, he says, Bein taglachas adam rishon kimo shishi shvi. So this would be referring, remember again, the chap over here is if he's a suffix mitzora. So remember again, we have two hair cuttings that are occurring, one on day 1 and one on day 7. So the Gemara suggests over here that halacha l'maisa, one oath would ultimately be for the suffix sifro. Suffix sifro ultimately means for the suffix of the counting of days 1 through 7, and one for the suffix of his tumah. Taglachas revius. We will say, what about the fourth hair cutting? So again, remember, just that's what we're doing over here, right? Remember, we said before in the Gemara that halacha l'maisa, there are 4 hair cuttings, right? And in each of the hair cuttings, there are different karbanos which are brought. We're just going through the 4 hair cuttings and what is brought at each stage. I will say last line, Samech Amid Aleph, 68. Taglachas revius, what happens at the 4th hair cutting? Maybe carbon tara. Ultimately, again, you bring a carbon tara. As well as remember again, what does the 4th hair cutting represent? What does the 4th hair represent? End of the road. At this point in time, what you've done, Abba say, is you've gone through all the different scenarios, offered up all the different combinations of karbanos. 4th hair cutting, maybe carbon tara. You bring your carbon ultimately again for tara, umasni, and I will say ultimately again you make the following umasni, and ultimately again you make the necessary conditions. Says the Gemara on the days v'i vadai naziru. So ultimately, again, if he's a definitive, right, ivadai naziru, ola harishona chova, v'zunadava. Ultimately, again, the first one will satisfy my obligation, and this carbon should be a nadava, v'tame umuchlatu, and ultimately, again, if he's a tame and a muchlat, i.e. tumas meis, and a mitzora, ola harishona nadava, the first ultimately, again, should be a nadava, v'zu chova. And this ultimately again should be the obligatory carbon. V'zeh, we'll say the zeh refers to the chaklas and shlamim, shar karbano. Ultimately again should satisfy the rest of my carbonic obligations. Fine. So the Gemara says, Tamei safek umuchlat vadai. What happens, we'll say, if we're talking about a case of where he is definitively Tamei. I'm sorry, Tamei misafek, but ultimately again definitively a mitzora. Ochel bekachim la'achar shmona yamim. He has the ability to go ahead and eat kachim after 8 days. And and ultimately he has the ability to go ahead and become Tamei L'meis. I should say his Nazirus is over, i.e. he could drink wine and become Tamei L'meis after 67 days. I will say, so we're just transitioning over here now. We've gone through, right, so now we've effectively dealt with the first category of cases. What's the first category of cases? That's the Mishnah's case. Mishnah's case is definitive Nazir who finds himself overwhelmed with Safek. What happens in life? Sometimes you lose yourself in the Safek. Right, so we'll say, what are his Safekas? Safek number 1, Tumas Meis. Safek number 2, Saras. So we'll say, so now we've seen how do you effectively deal with that? Well, first of all, here's what we know. We know that, I will say, in order to resolve all of that Safek, how many haircuts? 4 haircuts. Each of those haircuts are going to require different karbanos at different intervals in order to address all of the different layers of Safek. What's the duration of this process? What's the duration? Well, the Mishnah just deals with the Nazir Mu'atas, so it's going to be 60 days until you can eat karbanos, 120 days until your Neder Nazirus is over. But obviously, the timeline is going to be dependent on what? The duration of your Nazirus. The longer your Nazirus, the longer the process of resolution. But bottom line is, it's at least a 60, 120-day model, 60 days for karbanos, 120 days for Neder Nazirus, 4 haircuts, 4 shavings, with different sacrificial rites at each of those intervals. Now, the Gemara is just transitioning to a different kind of case over here. Tamei Safek Umuchlat Vadai. What happens if you have a Nazir who is a Safek Tamei, but definitely a Mitzorah? So we'll say, what do you do in this case? Ochel b'kachim la'achar shmona yamim. So he's able to eat kachim after 80 days. Because Rabbi say, remember again, since he's a vadai Mitzorah, so again, we know how to rectify his particular situation. And therefore he's able to go ahead and eat after 8 days. And ultimately, again, his Nazirus is over after 67 days. Muchlat Safek Tamei Vadai was what happens if you have a guy, ultimately, again, Safek Mitzorah, but definitively Tamei. Ochel b'kachim la'achar shloshim b'shiva yamim. In this case, he could eat kachim after 37 days. And ultimately his Neder Nazirus is over after 74 days. I will say the rush on the site goes through all the calculations. With this, again, I will say it's the same mechanism we saw before. Tamei vadai umuchlat vadai. So we'll say finally we're up to a case of vadai. What happens if you have a guy who is Tamei vadai muchlat vadai? So he's a Nazir. He's definitely Tamei tumas meis, and what? Also definitely a Mitzorah. So Rabbi say in this case, Ochel b'kachim la'achar shmona yamim. He has the ability to eat kachim after 8 days. I will say, so remember again, because remember we have the purification process for taras and the purification process for tumah, which each span what? Each span 7 days. Now remember again, after that tumah is resolved, then what? Then halacha l'maaseh he has the ability to eat kachim. V'shosiyanim b'tamei l'meisim la'achar arba'im v'arba'a yomim. And ultimately, again, he's able, his Neder Nazirus is going to be over after 44 days. Fine. Shalu Talmidim, Rabbi Shimon Yochai. So let's listen to this. The Talmidim asked Rashbi, Nazir tar umitzora maushi galech taglachas achas. So we'll say this is okay. So switching gears now. So we'll say, now listen to this. The Talmidim of Rashbi asked in the following question. We'll say, listen to how beautiful this is. What happens in the following situation? A Nazir tar who's a mitzora. Who's a Mitzorah? In other words, Rabbi say, so now, not the same case. Going back to what we originally had. Right? I have a guy who's a Nazir. David Hatzlacha. So the life of Hatzalah member. Mamish, don't get a minute. So I'll say, so listen to this. So Shalu Talmidav es Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So listen to this. The Talmidim asked Rashbi as follows. What happens if a person is a Nazir tar and a Mitzorah? Now we'll say, so take a look. At Rashi. So in Rashi, we'll say it's in the intermediate lines, the middle lines. So Shalom Tamindas Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai mipnei ma Nazir tar. No, actually, no, not yet. Okay, so let me just say this outside. That was a good rush here that I wanted to show you. Okay, fine. So we'll say here's the question. You have a Nazir tar and a Mitzorah. We'll say here's the case. The case where imagine the following situation. Ruvain, we'll call him, is a Nazir who contracted saras. Happens to the best of us. So now what happens? It happens to be his Nazirus concludes on the same day that he begins to count his Yemei Tara for Nazirus. Now, boss, remember again, a Nazir, how long is the purification process of a Nazir? How long? 7 days. 7 days. Right? So 7 days. What do you do on the 7 days? What happens on day 1? Haircut. What happens on day 7? Haircut. The case in question is, Rabbi say, day 1 of his purification process for Tzaras happens to coincide with what? The last day of his Nazirus. So say, what's the shaila? Could one haircut count for both? That's the shaila. Could one haircut count for both? Right? I'm going to cut. Right? So Reuben's going to cut his hair. He's going to shave. Because well, remember again. Now remember, what does Mitzorah have over Nazir? What does Mitzorah have over Nazir? Mitzorah is not just the haircut, right? What's Mitzorah? What's Mitzorah? Full body shaving, right? So obviously Nazirus only has just the haircut, but Lamaisa, the shaila is on the din of the haircut. On the din of the haircut. Could one haircut satisfy both obligations, right? So Nazir tar u'mitzorah mashir galech taglachas achos va'olalo lekanu lekan, and it should count for both. Amar lahen, Rashbi responded, Eino megalech. No, it does not work. It does not work, right? At the end of the day, one haircut ultimately again will not go ahead and work for both. Amar lo lama. So I said to them, I understand why not? A haircut is a haircut is a haircut. So why wouldn't one haircut go ahead and work for both, in other words, to satisfy both obligations? Amar boss, listen to this. Amar, this is incredible. Ilu zelagadol b'zelagadol. So we'll say, listen to this. Because in order for a haircut to work for multiple obligations, the obligations have to really be addressing the same criteria. So for example, if the point of the haircut was for the hair to regrow for both of them, or if the point of the haircut was to remove hair for both of them, then ultimately again, Yafa atem omrim, you're saying good. Achshav nazir laha'avir u'mitzorah legadel. They both say they have two different purposes. What's the purpose ultimately again of the haircut for the nazir? What's the purpose? What's the purpose? To remove that which grew during the nazirus. Ultimately again, what's the purpose of the mitzorah? To ultimately again regrow the hair afterwards. Well, so take a look at the Rush for just a moment. The Rush articulates this very beautifully. In my Rush, it's 4 lines up from the bottom. Nazir lahavir hu ma'avir se'ar legamrei ve'eno tzarich legadlo ol l'shem mitzvah. So Rabbi say when a Nazir cuts his hair, so Rabbi say what does a Nazir do? What is he doing when he cuts his hair? His goal is just to remove. Does he have any obligation to regrow? Is there any regrowth obligation by Nazir? None. Conversely, look at the Rush. Mitzor legadel betaglachas rishon shel mitzorah sarich legadel saro kedei legol choshenis laachar yimei sifuro. Oh, they will say, watch this. When a Nazir shaves on day 1, they will say, what's the goal? What's the goal? What's the goal? To shave again when? Day 7. So Rashbi says the haircuts have 2 different purposes. For the Nazir, it's to remove that which has grown, and we don't care about regrowth afterwards. For the Mitzorah, it's to shave and then to regrow for whatever degree is possible, because there's going to be another shaving when? On day number 7. So Rashbi says, therefore, because the haircuts serve 2 different purposes, one haircut cannot take care both of the end of the Nazirus and the first haircutting of the Tara of the Mitzorah. Incredible. Sa'ai says the Gemara, v'lo sa'lelo v'mechiluto v'sa'lelo v'meisifro. Shabbos says at the end of the day, Shabbos says, so maybe halacha l'maisa, that I understand this logic applies to which haircut I was saying? To the first haircut of the Mitzorah. But maybe it should count for the second one. In other words, we'll say, at the end of the day, the Rosh says, "B'taglachas ashniya shalom mitzorah tala taglachas nazirus kevan sheshneim lahavir seyar." So we'll say, so maybe we should say. Now we'll say the question itself is a little bit lopsided, as we already know. But Lamaisa, the Gemara says, why not? Okay, so I understand. So the Rashbi, you're saying one haircut could only satisfy 2 obligations when, if the hair cutting serves the same purpose for both. So therefore, the first haircut of the Mitzorah can't count as the end haircut of the Nazir. Why? Because the end haircut, the haircut of the Nazir is what I will say to what? To remove hair with no obligation of regrowth, and the first haircutting of the Mitzorah is to allow for regrowth. So maybe the second haircutting of the Mitzorah should be able to count as the concluding haircutting of the Nazir. Since what Rabbi say, they're both for what? Removal with no obligation for regrowth. Take a look, Rabbi say, ultimately at the rush. Third line from the bottom. We're fine. Tush the Gemara says, Amar Lahan, Rashbi says, you're right. Ilu zelifnei zrikas damim, zelifnei zrikas damim, yafa atomim. Both say, if the hair cuttings were sacrificially the same, in other words, if both of the hair cuttings took place before the zrika of sacrificial blood, I would agree. Here's the problem. Ela mitzora lifnei zrikas damim, v'nazir la'achar zrikas damim. Both say the problem is, for the mitzora, the hair cutting takes place before zrika, and for the Nazir, the hair cutting takes place after Zrika. So Rabbi says, so now, what Rashbi is saying is like this. In order for one haircut to satisfy two obligations, what has to happen? Number one, the hair cutting itself has to be done for the same purpose, right? In other words, in this case, hair removal with no need for regrowth. Number two, it has to be done at the same time in terms of the timeline for sacrificial rites. But for Mitzorah, ultimately hair cutting is done before Zrika. For Nazir, the hair cutting is done after Zrika, therefore it's not going to work. I says more fine. V'lo sa'le lo limeit saraso neziruso, v'sa'le lo limeit saraso vitum aso. So Rabbi says, so ultimately again, perhaps we should say that halacha l'maisa, so maybe you could use the same haircut, ultimately again for tsaras and tumah. In other words, if the Nazir became Tameh, let those two, in other words, what was it? Now, all of this presupposes that your timelines coincide, right? That a Nazir who is about to become purified from his saras contracts Tumah. So now he's a Nazir B'Tumah, ultimately, or I should say, the timeline for his Nazir B'Tumah coincides with saras. So now I want to use one haircut for both, and I will say, this would seem to work, because for both of them, the goal is hair cutting for the purpose of regrowth, right? And ultimately, again, the sacrificial timeline would seem to be the same as well. To which Rashbi says, Amar lahem, ilu zelifnei bias mayim, yafa ata omrim. You know what I will say? So Rashbi says, if both of them did it at the same time as mikvah, in other words, if mikvah was the same place in the timeline, I would agree. Here's the problem. Ela tamei la'achar bias mayim. I will say, tumas meis, he cuts, for Tamei Nazir, he cuts his hair from Tumas Meis. He cuts his hair after immersion in the mikvah. Mitzora lifnei biasmayim. Ultimately, again, but from Mitzora, we'll say, when does he do his hair cutting? Ultimately, again, before immersion in the mikvah. To which the Gemara says, Amrlo. So we'll say, we'll do over here. We'll pause here. So we'll say, so just to understand what I want to do, a little piece on the parasha. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, what we're ending off over here is in the Shaila of Rashbi. And the Shaila of Rashbi is we're trying to figure out, we'll say, is there ever a case where you could multi-purpose one haircut? Right? So in other words, if I have a situation where multiple statuses are ending at the same time, and those multiple statuses all require a haircut, is there a possibility of one haircut satisfying multiple obligations? You see where Rashbi is going with this. So we see the writing on the wall, right? Where is Rashbi going with this? Rashbi is essentially saying, yeah, it could work, as long as what? Everything aligns. The whole timeline aligns. In other words, immersion in mikvah is done at the same time. Zrika is done at the same time. The purpose of the hair removal is for the same time. Which I will say, essentially, we're going to see that really never happens, right? That's never going to happen. You're not going to have everything. Well, I shouldn't say that. It appears that you're never really going to get everything in alignment. Therefore, it sounds like what Rashbi is saying is that one haircut can't go ahead and satisfy multiple obligations. Let me just share with you a short idea in the parasha.